record. All right, this is the Think Big for the Verify testing team for January 5th, 2021. Today we have some folks from engineering productivity and representing package as well, who came to us with a problem or an opportunity around tracking a team's coverage data within a monorepo, which we use at GitLab. And so that's the topic today, is test coverage in monorepos. And I'm going to go ahead and open it up so we can discuss the problem to solve there while I try to remember exactly what the problem to solve was beyond that high-level description. Daniel or Ricky, I'm sure that you have the context better in head than I do. If you want to jump in, feel free, and I'll take some notes for a change.
Sorry, my hotkeys weren't working. So the problem, as I understand it, is that we want to keep track of monorepo code coverage. So when there's multiple teams operating in a single project within GitLab, how can we give each of those teams a meaningful metric to track their score in code coverage for the code that they own? So if one team works in generally these files or this area of the project, what's the code coverage for the files that they own, as opposed to the code coverage for the whole project? So it's kind of the reverse of what we're looking at in the group code coverage feature, where we're kind of wanting to amalgamate the scores across multiple projects within a group and then give like a high level score for kind of that director or group manager persona, as opposed to, so it's the opposite of that, where we want to actually give it to an individual team lead within a monorepo or an individual engineer within a team that's working on a monorepo, and so that they have more meaningful code coverage data.
Yeah, I think that was a good summary. And the thing that I would add is that we have a couple of interesting scenarios at GitLab with teams who have ownership over areas of the monorepo, as well as ownership over independent projects. And so it's sort of tracking down, exactly where their code coverage is at as a way to help improve that, because it's something that we're actually accountable for as individual contributors, is code coverage, and often the case. And it's really hard to figure that out. And right now, when I asked this question a little while ago, I was like, well, you go to this page and then you figure out the stuff you've worked on and you check the coverage of that and you add it all up. And so making that simpler for people so that they could actually figure out where to put their energy is kind of what I'm aiming for. But it's interesting here because we do have teams who are accountable for separate independent projects as well. And maybe that could be a separate point of conversation.
So it sounds like there's overlap. So a team may have bits of the monorepo, different bits of functionality, different chunks of files, as well as other projects disparately that are outside of the monorepo. Just make sure I understood all that correctly.
Yeah, we have sort of, I feel like we have a nice spread across the continuum of different scenarios here. One is like some teams operate within the monorepo and maybe there are areas of the code base that they are commonly looking after. Some teams have that as well as a separate project entirely. And then some teams work almost entirely in a separate project, which is a lot easier for that team because then they can just look at the code coverage for that particular project, but sort of pulling that stuff together is pretty manual by the sound of it at the moment.
Yep. Okay. I think that's a good high-level summary of the problem. So if we continue in and talk about who has that problem, what job are they trying to do? I'm going to start out. This sounds very similar to in a previous lifetime working at a company that was in a monorepo. And as we started to break into microservices, my teams are responsible for multiple workflows through the monorepo, as well as we started to break things out. So my team lead would want to have seen what's our test coverage across the bits that we're responsible for, both within those little projects that we have in microservices and then what we still have within the monorepo itself. So it sounds like that's a use case or a person who would have that problem. Who else might have this problem, or what job would they be trying to do?
I'm thinking about
Barrett.
quality engineers.
Okay.
Yeah, quality engineers, software engineers in test are working within a team in some cases, and they're going to want to understand where to put their focus as well. So it's those people are going to want to be able to see this, I imagine. I'd say that was one. I think, I don't know, I don't want to speak for anyone here who's a product manager, but I wonder about whether product managers are trying to help prioritize some quality work if there's, if it's a, zero coverage scenario, which we don't have, thankfully. But, maybe we prioritize some quality work a little bit more. Again, that prioritization is a little up to the product manager. Scott, you were going to say something? Sorry, I didn't mean.
No, you're good. I was thinking also the individual contributor. If I am wanting to see how our team is doing in code coverage, if I look at the whole monorepo, it's not going to be very helpful for me, and I'm just not going to really care too much. It's going to be easier for me to sit on the side and let other people kind of build our code coverage up more. But if I'm able to see it as a team, more an atomic bit of that whole monorepo, it'll help me know where to focus and see how we're doing as a team in improving that.
Yeah, I think another area would also be kind of those higher seniority engineers, so staff engineers and above, who are usually thinking more holistically about things. They might want to look at different slices of the monorepo, and that's what I'm starting to think about now. When Dan mentioned quality engineers, at GitLab, at least a lot of the times our quality engineers or SETs are split across multiple teams. And so being able to see like the slices that they're responsible for would kind of be useful. So for example, if there's a quality engineer split between testing and CI, I'd rather look at those two things lumped together so I can know how to best spend the time.
Yeah, and jumping back up to the product managers prioritizing test, Ricky and I have been having a conversation on and off, I think for about 6 months now, about risk-based testing and identifying workflows through the business cases. So like if you're the product manager for an e-commerce experience, you want to make sure that that checkout is rock solid. And so you might take a look and see, hey, what's our test coverage like in that checkout workflow? Is it at 80% or above versus a product listing page? You would maybe want to prioritize more test coverage in the checkout flow than in the listing flow, just to reduce risk in the e-commerce app. So I could see a product person or product manager prioritizing that or wanting to have that view of things.
I should probably also mention my own workflow, my own job to be done.
Yeah.
I'm mentioning other people first. Yeah, for me as a senior manager, I have multiple teams that I'm accountable for at some level. And so I'm interested in sort of looking at those teams and individually as those teams sort of being able to see where that coverage is at, to see if there's a conversation that needs to be had, or maybe we need more focus in that area. And then, I mean, would it be great, but I think this is maybe several iterations down the road, is sort of being able to roll that up into something that's actually useful. I would suggest that maybe directors have the same need. I don't want to speak for anyone who's not here, but I would be interested in seeing that. You were going to say something, James? Sorry, else.
Just agreeing, nodding and agreeing forcefully. Cool. There any other people who would be doing this job or wanting to solve this problem?
The one other I think of is like delivery team, Infra. There's the sort of Infra side peeps. They probably, it might be interesting to look at this as part of, I think we often think about code coverage when we're, say, adding new areas of the app. Maybe there's new functionalities we're adding and we want to make sure there's coverage. But overall, if we're going to roll out something change the infrastructure somewhat, maybe getting a slice of that code and seeing, you know, where the coverage is at to determine risk from an infrastructure standpoint. Maybe I don't want to speak for anyone over there, but maybe that's something to think about as well. That might be different slicing though. More like, this is the thing we're deploying, what's the coverage in this release?
Yeah, so that release manager persona might be wanting to look at that and say,
Yeah.
hey, here's new code that's coming in. What's your test coverage? Is it looking good? What's your quality score?
And
things like that.
Yeah, and it might be like, this is the stuff that's in the release rather than necessarily team focused, but then attributing that to the team might be helpful at that point. So that's kind of, and I'll stop.
Yeah, well, that makes sense too, because a lot of the pretty much all the teams at GitLab are oriented around different areas of the product and different workflows and different features. So that kind of team/feature alignment makes sense for a lot of different stakeholders, and just because of the way that we organize. The other thing I was thinking about is like security engineers, or we're talking about risk a lot. So the people in the organization who care most about the risk that introducing new code has would probably care about that. And they're probably also going to be caring about it in a more holistic way, rather than just code coverage as being the single metric. They're going to be thinking about SAS scanning, DAS scanning for the new different slices, and all the different tools that we kind of have available in order to quantify risk in code.
Cool. All right, so if I look at all of those different personas and all of the different jobs that we're trying to do, one theme kind of comes across of, we want to organize outside of the normal repository structure of files and directories or groups, even in projects, and say, these bits of code in my monorepo all organize under this unit, whether that unit is a team or a team of teams, if you start to roll those things up, or a slice of a release even, where you can say that all of this stuff is going into the release, and seeing for those bits of code, what are metrics, we'll say loosely metrics, but we can niche down into test coverage, are associated with that over either this point in time against our default branch, or for this release, or looking back over time even, if you wanted to track things historically. Does that sound like a very high level view of the problem and what we'd be trying to accomplish? I see some nodding and thumbs. Okay, excellent. I got close at least. Double thumbs. I love it.
Yeah, if we were able to take some kind of slice of a repository and have, I was thinking about when Ricky brought up that there's all these other scans that will probably want to have a similar segmentation. Would it make sense if you could take a slice of a repository and say, this part of it, I want to do all my regular project and repository functions, DAS, SAS, code coverage, but I want to pretend that it's only this, and sort of have the smaller slice operate exactly like a full project would. And then that might make, I'm just thinking about if you could pretend that this part of your project was a whole project, it might be easier to bring over all that functionality in the same way it operates and not reinvent things. Just sort of say, like, pretend it's only this, now do it all again. Does that kind of line up with some of the, I'm not as familiar with what the higher level persona jobs to be done are, but does that make sense to people?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that if you could start to structure things just by file, like, you're going to get 80% of the use cases. I think there's cases where different Like you're going to have multiple workflows that all use the same bits of code. So they're going to try to reuse or use the same file, which you could probably do, or only use parts of a file where that breaks down. But that's probably in the long tail, I would think.
Yeah.
We can validate that though, for sure. Awesome.
Yeah, I was thinking about one worry that I had about that abstraction is it kind of leads you down, or at least it leads my brain down a path of where I'm running duplicate pipelines, and that's not something that I want to get into because that'd be pretty inefficient and it would cost money to do. So I'd be thinking about, well, how can we break down these reports by file a little bit and then associate those chunks of files with a label or a group or a collection of some sort, a generic collection.
Cool. Before we think too small on that, let's keep thinking big and think about for our VP or director personas or team lead personas, what's the ideal outcome look like for them? What at the end of the day did they get if they can start to organize by file, thinking more about the what than the how?
I think that depends on what the end result is, because I know we, like you said, we're talking about this risk dashboard a lot. I think that would be really great to have that single number rolled up, and that's kind of the opposite of what we want to do right now, where we want to kind of have these more fine-grained points. I think that that would help the VP director personas, like Dan was saying, when they're talking with their direct reports about their performance. That's another metric that they could introduce to those conversations. So that's like, hey, I noticed that for your team's area, the code coverage is much lower than the average. What's going on there? So like that's a good trigger for that type of conversation to have with data.
Yeah, you're referring, when you say the ideal outcome, maybe you could clarify what you mean by that. I think I'm thinking outcomes and outputs, right? But like outcomes for this would be just a super simple level rolled up percentage coverage for a specific team's code area.
So taking that a step further then,
yeah.
What do you, as the director for the group, see as, what's your outcome of having that? What is your team able to do with that data?
Yeah, and I think we were talking a little bit about that before, where we're saying if I can look at that data, I would agree with Ricky in general that I'm going to be saying, hey, we have these targets. The target is 80% or whatever it is, I forget right now, but the target is X. You're at Y. How do we make it X type thing? Or you're at Z. Good job type thing. No worries. Maybe don't prioritize it as much. But realistically, from my perspective, I'm not trying to have that. I'm a stopgap. I'm a check. After the fact, you want the team lead, the manager, to be able to work on that themselves without having, senior manager / director coming along going, hey, what's up with this number, right? And so that would be important for it to be self-service and single source of truth type thing, of being enabling EMs to be looking at the number and going, oh, I need to adjust this. How do I check in on that? The only difference for myself is I'd want to roll those numbers up into multiple teams. But I think, again, that's another iteration off first.
Sure. So then breaking that down, we talked about like the senior manager, the director is going to want to see that rolled up by the teams. The team lead obviously is going to want to see that. But at the end of the day, we want to enable developers to act on that data quickly, easily as part of their daily workflow. So what does that potentially look like? How are Scott, Drew, and Eric going to know they're contributing to their team goal of increasing coverage of their area by 5% this quarter?
I think that kind of team-based dashboard, or however we decide to make the slices happen, would be good to kind of surface to individual teams. And I know we do that sometimes, like putting stuff in the agenda or having the SciSense dashboard or stuff like that, just putting those metrics in front of people so that they can see it and incorporate it into their workflow. I think that would kind of solve that problem.
I'm just looking for the actual PI definition on the handbook for code coverage.
I think it'd be nice if we had like the chart of what our team's test coverage is, what our historical test coverage has been, and maybe tied in with other metrics that we have, such as the number of bugs our team has had in the past. So as our test coverage has gone up, are we actually lowering our bugs? Is there some benefit that we're getting out of it? As a team, we could see, how the test coverage, how our input of increasing our test coverage is actually benefiting us.
I think the longer we talk about these types of problems, we often go back to that kind of holistic dashboard where it'd be nice if we could see everything that is about like the metrics for the code for our individual slice. We want the code quality, we want the SAS scans with the DAS scans, the bug issues. We want all that stuff on one page where we can kind of go and see the stats.
You're also going to want to know what the target is. So
Yep.
That's, I think, important. I don't want to, for people writing code regularly, but from my perspective, I want to see where the target is and how far off and what the trend line is. So if we're trending up and we're pretty close, I'm not going to be stressed about it.
We've also talked about different targets. We've also talked about different targets for different areas of the code, where you talk about riskier code, you want a higher test coverage value. Less risky code doesn't need as much test coverage. So you might want to break it down that way and say high risk code, we want it 80%, medium risk 60, whatever it might be, and start to drill down into that as well as then setting thresholds potentially of, if you're working in a high risk area, your MR can't let the test coverage threshold get below 75%. Ideally, it's at 80%. That could be another outcome that we get out of organizing the code in this way, of not just setting it by the project, but setting it by the team, or however you want to organize these things.
Yeah, I think from a product offering standpoint, I think that's probably really important. I think as you were saying that, I was thinking about the practice of writing code and writing tests and how we go about doing that. And I think that's one of the other ways that I might interpret additions of code without, that detract from our overall coverage percentage, is why we're ending up not actually writing tests as part of our code and covering our area, what's contributing to that. So there's that element of analysis that I've kind of been doing as well. I think there's cases where, this is some area where we have to get it out, and we're going to skip this because it's a prototype or whatever, it's behind a feature flag or whatever. Maybe there's explanations that make sense. In general, I wouldn't want to be seeing people adding code without test coverage. That would be that'd be a good conversation.
Okay. Cool. So we have some really great ideal outcomes here, I think. Looking then externally into the market, how could we differentiate within GitLab those kinds of outcomes from existing solutions? SonarQube, CodeCov, Coveralls, they all offer this sort of functionality where you can start to get coverage around projects and different areas of the code. How can we differentiate within GitLab? How can we leverage the GitLab offering to really make this a best-in-class type of solution? And we are close to time if folks need to drop off.
Yeah, I've started calling this GitLab overtime, by the way. Once we go past the 5 minute to go mark, this is GitLab overtime. And I would say, to answer the question, I think I'm always thinking about how our integrated solutions can contribute to offering great products to our customers. And so that means how we actually integrate this data in a way that's helpful. I think splitting across multiple different axes of information could be really valuable here because we have access to everything in theory. So being able to have a different view for a release manager or something like that is something that might be pretty interesting, but also integrating it in pipelines and doing all sorts of stuff like that could be really cool. I think that's a pretty generic answer, so I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. I think this organization idea, though, of saying all of these chunks of files are this new logical thing and being able to apply all of the different lenses to that. So saying, here's code coverage, here's code quality, here's whatever else you want for this release, the files that have changed in this release, here's how those metrics look compared to the last release that we did, or compared to all of the default branches that these projects are shipping. Same thing for monitoring of here's what it looks like in production, here's how it looked before, here's how it looked now, things like that, where the integrated solution, you could start to apply all of these things in various bits and places as people use more stages.
Well, we're also started talking about only running tests for code that have changed to limit the time it takes to run testing, right? And so this could align pretty well with that as at the same time, right? Just an integrated, here's a differential test run, differential coverage change, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
As we get better with that, running very specific, like running tests for changes, there could be a cool integration where it dumps you right back into the web IDE and says, hey, there's no coverage here. You just added, you added some code here that doesn't have a test. And this is where all the other tests are. Click here, you go right back into the IDE and write your test, save, run.
I like that idea, Drew. I was just laughing. It's like, hey, you don't have enough coverage. We're going to dump you back in here, write some code now before we'll let you proceed.
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm not against it.
I think one of our ideal outcomes the last
your
time.
Pipeline.
Yeah.
Try this again.
Pause the pipeline. One of the last times we did this, one of the ideal outcomes was DangerBot actually just creates an MR with a stubbed test for you. Here's an assert, fill in the missing chunk, and you just accept the change and you're good to go.
That'd help me a lot when I go to write code.
Yeah, right. Just you'd have like the green apply test coverage button in your merge request, and you just
all of those tests would fail, of course, because that's how we stub out our test.
This is where the ML and the AI come in.
It reminds me of like rubbing a dog's nose in it. It's like, no, write the test. Bad developer.
That's why I started laughing about it. It's just kind of like drop them out into a screen that's like just failing tests going, here's what you should have done.
As long as it's not clippy. It looks like you should have written a test here. Would you like a template?
I wish GitLab would tell me, like, just like, oh no, here's the good code. Just do this instead and it'll be fantastic. That'd be amazing for me.
All right.
I'm gonna drop peeps. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks, Dan. That was an excellent Think Big. Thank you, everyone. Ricky and Dan, who just left, thank you as always for taking notes for me, because I never do. Next week, we'll have our Think Small, taking this down to a super small MVC that we can implement in an upcoming milestone. So we'll be thinking big or thinking small next week. All right. Thanks, everybody. Cheers.
Thanks. Take care.